This is your PowerPoint for Unit 3, and today we're going to deal with the American ideologies during the Age of Western Expansion, which is really the 1800s, 1800 up to 1900. And the big argument that I want to get across during this time period is the central role of the frontier in shaping the way Americans thought of themselves. Much of our tradition of being rugged individuals, of being suspicious of any kind of centralized power, and really believing that we have unending opportunities for innovation come out of this age. It comes out of this age in which we expanded out into the Western territories and saw so many opportunities for ourselves to continue growing and developing, and that definition of our character has remained ever since. So in order to understand this, we really do have to go to the War of 1812. Unlike the American Revolution, which definitely established the foundations of the country, the War of 1812 in many ways establishes where our character comes from in the expansion out to the frontier. So in the American War of 1812, it was perceived at the time as a war for national sovereignty. Well, why was this the case? Well, once again, we were fighting the British, but unlike the first time in which we saw ourselves as British but needing to separate, this time the fear was the British were trying to violate our rights of being what we call sovereign. What do I mean by sovereign? Sovereignty means that we have our own independence. We have our ability to establish our political and cultural identity for the future. The argument at the time was that the British were violating this, and they were violating it in two specific ways. First, the British were impressing Americans to join the British Navy. Why were they doing this? Well, at the time, the British and the French were locked in the Napoleonic Wars. At that time period, France had been under the power of Napoleon. They had been expanding out into the rest of Europe. The British and the French were trying to fight amongst each other, and the British were the only holdouts in Europe at that time against Napoleon. And so Napoleon's navy had blockaded the British island. In order to deal with this, both sides, the British and the French, were impressing anybody who tried to trade with their enemies. The British were impressing at the time period what they thought were British soldiers who had left the Navy and had joined up with the Americans in order to escape this war. In some cases, the British did end up getting Americans on board by accident into their Navy. A second issue that was important was the arming of native tribes. American citizens had been expanding outwards into the Ohio River Valley, causing anger amongst the American tribes in that region. Many of them were allies of the British. So the British had been arming these Native Americans, partly because of their alliance and partly because the British wanted to have some kind of influence on the northern continent. Because of this, Americans thought that they had had their rights violated, and so they went to war against the British, which at that time period, both the British Navy and the Army were far superior to that of the Americans. In fact, the British were able to blockade the Americans with their Navy. At one point, one of our strategies was for the Americans to quickly go up into Canada, try to take it over by burning down and taking over the central capital there in Yorktown. In response to this, the British marched up to Washington, D.C. and burned down the White House. By the time we get out late into the war, it looks like the Americans are going to lose this war since they are having very few victories, except for out on the Great Lakes. But finally, the British decided that because of so many other commitments they have in the world, they were going to walk away from this conflict. So at the Treaty of Ghent, the British decided to grant the Americans finally their full-fledged sovereignty. The strange part about this war, though, was when the Treaty of Ghent was going on, there was a battle that did take place because the soldiers just didn't get the information in time to know that the war was basically over, and that took place in New Orleans. There, General Andrew Jackson defeated the British general at that particular battle pretty well, and a big part of it was because of the strategy General Andrew Jackson had. In order to fight against the Americans, the British had to cross over a waterway, and as they crossed over, Jackson had formed a wall on the opposite side on the sandbanks, and basically the American soldiers just picked off all of the British as they got off of their ships. This is going to be important because General Andrew Jackson doing this action is going to become a mythical hero, and that's going to lead into his ability to become president. So before we can get to Andrew Jackson, we have to talk about one transitioning issue, and that's the American system. Americans, after the War of 1812, even though it was really a stalemate, really perceived what had happened as a victory. Well, why is this the case? Because they had kept the biggest army and navy from being able to take over the country. In response to this, there was a man named Henry Clay from Virginia who proposes what's called the American system. The American system was meant to be a national system for markets. The federal government would invest in things like the Cumberland National Highway, a highway that connected up all the states. Also, tariffs would be created in order to protect infant markets from foreign competition. Then, in 1816, the Congress charters the second national bank to attract investment. Now, here's the strange thing about this. Keep in mind that at this time period, the Federalists were gone. They had chosen, at the end of the War of 1812, at something called the Hartford Convention, in order to declare that if we didn't get out of the war, the North would secede from the country. When the war was, in essence, won, the Federalists looked like traitors. So the only party left at that time period, or faction, was the Democratic Republicans. Now, this is strange, considering that the Democratic Republicans under Henry Clay are proposing this need for a national economy, a national unification of the states. What it demonstrates is that politically we were a democratic republic, but economically we saw the need for a national marketplace. This brings up then the Jacksonian Democrats. So Americans have been able to move out further west, and a large part of this had to do with new innovations based upon steam. So paddle boats allowed for boats to go up and down the Mississippi River. Conestoga wagon was a larger wagon that allowed families to now travel out to the west. And railroads, which were not transcontinental yet, they were regional, not transcontinental, but regional. Railroads allowed people to travel out into the Western territories. As people traveled out into these Western territories, they tended to be the people who had not been given the right to vote back on the East Coast. And so when they established their territories into states, they granted universal suffrage for all white men who had property. This is what we call New Democracy. Why do we call it that? Well, for the first time, property is no longer going to be a prerequisite in order to vote and to engage into the political system. Andrew Jackson is going to run in 1824, not starting New Democracy, but on the tailcoats of New Democracy. He's going to become its symbol. And then a further symbolic action takes place. In 1824, when Andrew Jackson ran against John Quincy Adams, it wasn't just the two of them. There ended up being 4 individuals who ran for office. 3 of them were Andrew Jackson, John Quincy Adams, and Henry Clay. Henry Clay decided at the last minute to drop out, and when that took place, the votes were spread out. There was a plurality of votes. And so in order to deal with this, there were some backdoor deals that were made, and eventually John Quincy Adams got Henry Clay to agree to get all of his electors to come over and support Adams. This was seen as a backdoor deal that was called the corrupt bargain, and Jackson would use this to appeal to the common farmers against what was seen as the northern elite industrialists represented by John Quincy Adams. So that led up to this philosophy of Jacksonianism and the new Democratic Party. Jackson would appeal to the common farmers that these northern industrialists had stolen the election from them in 1824, and now were also trying to steal from them economically to the National Bank. At the time, the Second National Bank was led by a man named Nicholas Biddle. And Nicholas Biddle had some inefficiencies in the way that he ran the National Bank. And so Jackson and his supporters promoted Nicholas Biddle and the National Bank as being an industrial monopoly over the country. Jackson, when he eventually would come into office in 1828, would both veto the rechartering of the bank, and then he took the American military and went into the bank and forcibly removed the gold from the bank. Now, why would he go to this extent? I mean, all Jackson had to do was just veto that rechartering of the bank. Well, because this is the new philosophy. Jacksonianism was a philosophy of the rugged individual, states' rights, and the need to return all power, not just political, but economic, back to the states. By Jackson using the military to do this, he was demonstrating that there was a new order in town and that even the political military would be used to enforce that kind of level of rugged individualism. Jackson then went further and argued against the Supreme Court at that time that the Cherokee Indian in Georgia should be forcibly removed. Why? Well, in Georgia, they had found huge plots of gold. And the Cherokee Indian who were living at that time period in that area had taken their case all the way to the Supreme Court, where John Marshall, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, had argued they had a right to their private property. Jackson basically argued that this was not the case because Cherokee Indian were not Americans, and therefore the Georgian farmers should be benefited. Now, Jackson never did remove the Cherokee Indian. It was actually his successor who would end up forcibly removing them under violence. But Jackson established the precedent in order to do this. Jackson's overall philosophy was to promote states' rights, a defense of the local farmer against any centralized form of power, whether in government or industry. In response to this, we see the development in politics of a second political party, and this is the first time we will see a two-party system. It was called the Whig Party. Northern Democratic Republicans saw Jackson as claiming he was going to support states' rights, but then centralizing power in the executive to enforce that end goal. So they formed a national Whig Party to propose ideas similar to the Federalists that they believed would check and balance government, but at the same time move us towards industry. They argued for things like higher tariffs, investments in development, and a national bank. This sounds very familiar, I'm sure, to Alexander Hamilton and the Federalists. Also, after Jackson left office, they would point to the Panic of 1837, in which this panic, they claimed, was caused by the destruction of the National Bank and Jackson's pet banks giving out way too much money to farmers, leading to land speculation. For the first time now, we have seen the development of a two-party system. And from here on out, that is going to be the way America's political system has been run. This time, a Whig Party representing this northern attempt to unify the country, and Democratic Republicans who are under Jackson's philosophy trying to get as much power to the states as possible. Now, the other thing that's important for this time period to understand is the importance of the frontier. And we've seen this playing out after the War of 1812 with Jacksonianism. But in this particular case, I want to bring up how cultural effects and cultural power is developed. So back in 1803, President Thomas Jefferson had bought the Louisiana Territory from the French in that time period. The frontier that he had bought became symbolic for Americans. It was symbolic of rugged individualism, innovation, tight family values, because you needed strong families to run a farm, and a suspicion of centralized government. So this fits very well into the American mindset. Farmers who lived far away from Washington, who lived far away from government, did not want any interference in their daily life. Now, on the positive end, a French observer at one point after the French Revolution, a man named de Tocqueville, came to America and wrote something called Democracy in America. He argued that, unlike old Europe, Americans had done away with social hierarchy. They had created a completely egalitarian system. Now, what did he mean by egalitarianism? He's not talking here about economic egalitarianism. He's talking about social egalitarianism, in which basically inheritances or the sense of class or the sense that some people were better than others had been eradicated. Here in America, the common farmer may not be economically equal to the wealthy landowner, but socially he was equal. Well, what had allowed this to happen? Well, it was because of moving out to the frontier. New land gave Americans power, and that allowed them to vote, and that allowed them to change the political system. This would then lead into a new notion in America of human perfectionism. So that's the Second Great Awakening. You might remember in the First Great Awakening that took place in the 1740s, that awakening was really centered around Puritan ideas. In the 1820s, we're going to have a slightly different emphasis. Charles Finney, who at that time period was a Methodist, and he was a Methodist preacher, began revivals in New York. Now, yes, he called for personal repentance and salvation. Probably sounds similar to the First Great Awakening. But Finney was a Methodist, not a Puritan. So he argued that while individuals should seek out repentance, those individuals could then go out and counteract the greater social ills of slavery and materialism. So what's important to understand here is that Finney believed that our reliance upon God was absolutely necessary, but that reliance would lead not to just individual salvation, not just to eventual gaining of the afterworld, but rather an ability for us to perfect this particular world. Now, this would end up being reinforced by many Americans who believed that the end of the world was near, and this was a time period to usher in this new perfectionism before God would end all time. Methodist and Baptist preachers took this message, Baptist preachers like Peter Cartwright, and led religious revivals out on the western frontier. So perfectionism that was opened up by the Second Great Awakening led to a whole vast array of possible social reforms. For example, abolitionism, getting rid of slavery, was led by a man named William Lloyd Garrison. And Garrison wrote in a magazine that he created called The Liberator, calling for an immediate end to slavery. Temperance, the movement started by Neil Dow that called for a moderation of alcohol, but even to a certain extent the prohibition of it. For example, in Maine, we got the Maine law, which was intended to get rid of alcohol altogether. Why? Because the belief was that if human beings could get rid of these addictive substances, that then they would become better family individuals. They would work better within industry. The asylums. A woman named Dorothea Dix called for the need to reform asylums based upon a scientific and more rehabilitative model in order to improve problems of mental illness in society. In public education, Horace Mann called for the need for the state to fund public education to teach reading skills and biblical values to common farmers. Now, there was a darker side as well, though, to these reform movements, and this came under the form of what's called Nativism. In the 1840s, Irish and German immigrants were coming to the Northeast. The Irish were coming due to a potato famine that they had experienced back in their homeland. The Germans were coming because they had a failed democratic revolution against the Kaiser. Now, these immigrants came to the Northeast because there they could find an industrial marketplace that provided for jobs. But many people in that area started up what was called the Nativist movement, which reacted against the immigrants, claiming they could never truly be Americans. They were Catholic, they gave their allegiance to a foreign power, to a pope, and therefore could never be a part of the Protestant Protestant democratic spirit. Also, there was a fear that they were going to take many jobs from people up in the Northeast. In fact, there was a political party that was formed, didn't have a lot of power in the long run, called the Know Nothing Party. The reason why it didn't have a lot of political power was that the way it ran its party was to have the group of individuals act very suspiciously and secretly in order to try to keep out immigrants. If you ever asked them where their party was or what party they were a part of, their response was that they knew nothing, and that became the name of their party. Well, you can imagine if you create a party this way, you're not going to get much of a political base over the long run. But this was the darker side of these reform movements at the time, the belief that perfectionism could take place, but the fear of outsiders coming in and corrupting the American spirit. Another area for perfectionism was women's suffrage. Now, most of the time we tend to think of women's suffrage as the fight for the right to vote, but there's actually a deeper argument that's going on. Now, don't get me wrong, most women did see it this way. Most women saw that this was a fight for the right to vote. But there was a deeper argument amongst the leadership about what a woman's role in society ought to be. The reigning belief at the time was the cult of domesticity. Women's role was defined as a biological one in the household, with men being in the public sphere. This paralleled the development of local industry as a division of labor. What do I mean by that? Well, women were supposed to raise children so that the male children could then go out into society and be able to earn a living. The males who were already out in society would, of course, support the family so that the family could raise children. In many ways, this was a division of labor. However, many women leaders arose in order to challenge this, both out on the frontier and in religious revivals. For example, in the abolitionist movement, there were two sisters, Sarah and Angelina Grimke. These two sisters went from venue to venue arguing against slavery, and at one point they noticed that every venue they went to, their fellow abolitionists would shout them down from the stage, arguing that the two sisters were women and therefore had no right to be making these public comments. Sarah and Angelina Grimke argued that any form of discrimination would simply ripple over into other areas of life and continue other forms of oppression. So slavery, for example, might disappear eventually, but racism and discrimination would continue if discrimination as a whole were not stopped. This eventually led to the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848. In 1848, women leaders met at Seneca Falls in New York, and they wrote something called the Declaration of Sentiments, which was modeled after the Declaration of Independence. Now notice, yes, they argued for the right to vote, but they went beyond that. They argued for the right to own property, have a higher education, and for marriage rights. All of these things suggest that there was a deeper consciousness going on here than just the right to vote. The right to vote alone could have been justified, for example, as a way to become a better mother. But here, what the women are arguing for in the Declaration of Sentiments is that women are equal and should have more of a role within the public sphere. Probably one of the most important American philosophies of this time period, very unique to America, is Transcendentalism. Transcendentalism was largely a literary movement, but in many ways Transcendentalists looked to alternative forms of spirituality and philosophical approaches for the American character, and they tied it to the frontier. They argued that there was something in nature called the oversoul, that if you were to go out into nature, you could experience truth, you could experience true spirituality. Well, their big problem was the only place you could experience this was within nature. If you tried to experience it within the city, within the urban area, you would lose it because of the city being a sort of prison of anonymity. So because of that, they criticized urbanization in the American Northeast, and they called for a solution in which people would leave the urban area and seek out that rugged individualism in nature in the West. Some of the big individual authors that you should remember for this are Henry David Thoreau and Ralph Waldo Emerson. Now this leads into what these kind of transcendentalist and religious movements eventually led to, and this was true perfectionism, or at least the attempt to achieve it. Many communities looked for radical perfectionism, and their idea was to create a model community that could then be shared out for the rest of the world in how to reshape the way things were happening here on Earth. For example, the Brook Farm was a religious and feminist attempt to create a perfect community based upon collective sharing. The Shakers were a small religious community that tried to have a very simplistic way of life based upon collective sharing and abstinence. And yes, I do mean abstinence here. For Shakers, they believed that people should never have sex, period. So you're probably wondering how could they have kept their community going if that was the case. Shakers offered to local orphans that they would be a haven for them. When orphans came to live with them at the age of 18, they gave them a choice to either remain in the Shaker community or to leave. Most did leave, but some actually stayed because they found the Shaker community way of life to be simple, to be very loving and supportive, and so they were able to maintain themselves up until today. There was also New Harmony, which was started off by the industrialist Robert Owen, who he tried to create the perfect model socialist community in which people would share everything economically. And then there was Oneida, which was based upon transcendentalist ideas and religious ideas. It was based upon sharing both economic resources and, yes, eventually based upon getting rid of marriage altogether and to share partners as well. None of these communities lasted very long, except for the Shakers. The Shakers were able to maintain themselves up until today. The rest did eventually collapse. But what was important about these model communities is that they were the result of the Second Great Awakening's call for perfectionism here on Earth. So this eventually leads up to, how does this all influence politics? Well, the way it influences politics had to do with the fight at the national level over how to deal with the moral issue of slavery. In 1856, the Whigs eventually collapsed, and the reason why was that many of their followers had the perception that the Whigs had just compromised too much over slavery. Well, at the time, there were several parties that were competing to fill that gap, but the big party that was able to gather most people around itself was the Republican Party. And in 1856, they ran John C. Fremont, who lost in that election. But only 4 years later, Abraham Lincoln would win the presidency and solidify this Republican Party as the new party to compete against the Democrats. The Republicans internally were actually split between two groups: the immediatists, who wanted to get rid of slavery immediately, and the gradualists, who believed that over a long term they could get rid of it by developing industry and keeping slavery to the South. Abraham Lincoln himself, in 1860, actually started off as a moderate. He believed that, yes, slavery was evil, it had to be gotten rid of, but the best way to do that was gradually over time. But then in the midst of the Civil War, he becomes an immediatist. And Abraham Lincoln is very interesting on this, because Lincoln was religious, but he did not believe in institutionalized religion. And so when he came into government, he really didn't see his role in government as being one of religion. But by 1863, he himself said that God had put him into the office of the presidency in order to end slavery. Here we have a good example of how perfectionism has led now all the way into the national office of the country. So in 1893, to kind of wrap all this up, there's a man named Frederick Jackson Turner. And Turner writes, as a graduate student, a paper called The End of the Frontier Thesis. He argued that the frontier was soon closing with the growth of industry, and he feared that this was going to mean an end to the American character. There would be no more way to have rugged individualism, because from here on out we were moving into urban centers, industrialism, and that anonymity of the factory system. Turner's thesis signals what's going to happen in the 20th century, and it does raise a huge question. The question is there an American identity anymore? Has the American identity been lost? The American identity of the 1800s was really one of a farmer expanding out west and taking experimental and new types of innovations and opportunities. When you live within a city in which you pretty much have to work for others most of the time, and for most people are tied into a large urban anonymous center, do we still have an American identity? So what are the takeaways here? Well, the War of 1812 sets the context for the first sense of a unified United States, but at the same time there's a growing regionalism that's going to get us closer and closer to the Civil War. Within that growing regionalism, we see the development of the American frontier, and the frontier had the impact of creating a context for the belief in perfectionism, both through religious and secular ideas of transcendentalism. The end of the 1900s, though, signals a move away from the frontier, and we are now moving into the industrialization period. And the big question is, can we maintain the American character? Now, you could say on the one hand the American character is lost because we no longer have the frontier, or you could say the American character gets transferred. Maybe the American character gets transferred into small business competition. So that's really the big issue here, is what happens to the American character, the unique American character, as we move into the 20th century.